Hello everyone, and welcome to my Soap Twist 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The tension at Forrester Creations had been building for weeks, like a thundercloud looming above the sleek, modern offices where designs were created and alliances switched with each new collection. Rich Forrester, the man who had always seen himself as the unchallenged ruler of his father's fashion industry, felt the ground shift beneath him in unexpected ways. Eric, his own father, had made a move that cut deeper than any business adversary could. He had joined up with Katie Logan at her freshly reinvigorated Logan Designs, drawing resources, skill, and loyalty away from the Forrester family. Rich saw it as more than simply a business betrayal. It was a shattered family legacy that he had spent his entire life defending. Rich paced the executive room, his signature dark suit slightly rumpled after hours of passionate debate, his silver-streaked hair reflecting the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Los Angeles. Brooke had tried to soothe him earlier, placing her hand gently on his arm and reminding him that family was complicated and Eric had his reasons. But Rich was not listening. Not today. Not when each decision appeared to unravel another thread from the beautifully made tapestry. And then there was Will Spencer. Will, the young, ambitious son of Bill Spencer and Katie Logan, had been interning at Forrester Creations for some months. He carried himself with a confidence bordering on arrogance, which he had surely received from his father, but it was balanced by his mother's quieter determination. Will had begun small, fetching coffee, arranging fabric swatches, shadowing the design team, but his keen eye for trends and easygoing demeanor gradually won him new responsibilities. Rich had accepted him at first because Katie had asked, and family ties, even convoluted ones, were still important in this world. But tolerance had become thin. The Logan Forrester schism had made everything toxic. Katie's defection, Eric's silent support for her new business, rumors of designers abandoning ship, all pointed to a conflict Rich refused to lose. And Will, with his Spencer blood and Logan heritage, embodied everything Rich despised just now: divided loyalties, potential espionage, and a direct path to the enemy camp. Rich saw a threat every time Will strolled into a conference carrying his iPad and smiling casually. It came to a head on a typical Tuesday afternoon. The design team gathered in the conference room to go over prototypes for the upcoming collection. Steffi was there, as furious and protective as usual, her eyes narrowing whenever Will offered recommendations. RJ had just returned from a long journey, still adjusting to the changes, but already sensed the undercurrent. Electra hovered nearby, her gaze divided between the sketches and the lingering glances she exchanged with Will, which made RJ's jaw tighten. Rich stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, as Will pointed out an error in one of the gown silhouettes. The asymmetry here could be pushed further, Will said calmly. It would give it more edge, make it stand out in the evening wear category. Steffi gave him a look that could freeze fire. We've already finalized the proportions. This isn't a brainstorming session for interns. Will did not back down. I'm just saying. Rich cut him off, his voice quiet yet authoritative. You're saying too much, Spencer. The room became still. Will turned slowly to meet Ridge's stare. There was no fear in his eyes, only a glint of surprise that immediately turned into defiance. Ridge moved forward, closing the gap between them in 2 steps. You think you can waltz in here, throw around ideas like you own the place, while your mother is actively trying to gut this company? Ridge's words were measured, but the rage simmered behind them. Katie's building her little empire on Eric's back, pulling strings, and you're here playing both sides. Will's jaw clenched. I'm here to work, Ridge. Same as anyone else. Work? Ridge asked, laughing sharply and without amusement. You're spying. Or, at best, you're a walking conflict of interest. Either way, it's over. Steffi nodded in agreement, her arms tightly clasped. RJ squirmed uncomfortably, looking between his father and the young man who'd emerged as an unexpected competition in more ways than one. Will straightened and refused to shrink. You can't just... I can, Ridge interrupted. And I am. You're fired, Will. Pack your things. You're out of here. Today. The words hung in the air, like a slap. Will's face reddened, but he stood his ground. You think kicking me out changes anything? My mom's building something real. Something that doesn't rely on ego and control. Ridge's eyes narrowed. Get back to your mom's company, then. That's where you belong. Not here. Not pretending you're one of us. The phrase landed like a punch. Get back to your mom's company. It wasn't simply a rebuke. It was an expulsion, a reminder of his outsider status and mixed origin. Will gazed at Ridge for a long time, the room silent save for the gentle hum of the air conditioner. Then, without saying another word, he turned and walked away, shoulders straightened, refusing to give them the joy of seeing him break. The door closed behind him with a faint click that seemed louder than any slam. Will paused in the corridor, leaning against the wall for a little moment to catch his breath. His mind raced with wrath, shame, and an odd sensation of relief. He had anticipated this possibility. The lines had been drawn too strongly, and loyalties were too divided. But hearing it from Ridge, the man who had once accepted him for Katie's sake, hurt more than he had anticipated. He pulled out his phone, his hand hesitating over his mother's number. Katie would be infuriated. She would oppose this. But a part of Will questioned whether this was the right thing to do. Ridge ruled over Forrester Creations, and Will had never fit there. Perhaps Logan Designs, with its new vitality and Eric's guidance, was the true future. Back in the conference room, Ridge inhaled gently, energy still rushing through him. Steffi placed her hand on his shoulder. You did what you had to do, Dad. Ridge nodded, but his expression did not convey triumph. Only resolve. This war just got real. No more half measures. Brooke came minutes later, having heard about the disturbance in the Forrester office. She discovered Ridge staring out the window, lost in thought. What happened? She asked quietly. Ridge turned, his face a mask of restrained rage. I fired Will. Told him to go back to his mother's company. Brooke's eyes widened. Ridge. He doesn't belong here, Ridge stated firmly. Not anymore. Not with everything Katie's doing. Brooke sighed and stepped closer. He's Katie's son. Our families are intertwined, whether we like it or not. Not today, Ridge responded. Today, lines are drawn. The fallout spread rapidly. Whispers rushed through the corridors, with interns exchanging glances and designers whispering over sketches. Electra was shaken. Despite her problems with RJ, she had grown to like Will. RJ experienced a mix of satisfaction and uneasiness. His and Will's animosity, which had been smoldering for some time, finally had formal stakes. Katie got a call from Will himself an hour later. He stood outside the Forrester building, the Los Angeles sun blazing down, his stuff in a box at his feet. Mom, he said when she responded, Ridge fired me. Told me to get back to your company. There was a pause, followed by Katie's piercing, angry voice. He did what? Will describe the scene in vivid detail. Katie listened, her hand clenching around her phone. This is ridiculous. You're coming to Logan.
Right now.
We need you here. Will paused. You sure? I don't want to make things worse. Things are already worse, Katie stated. And your family. My family. Come home. He hung up the phone and stared up at the tall edifice one more time. Then he turned and walked away into a future that suddenly felt vast. Logan Design's environment was different, less polished and more dynamic. Eric had brought his ideas, decades of expertise, and a quiet defiance of the rigid organization he'd left behind. When Will arrived, Katie greeted him at the door and pulled him into a fierce hug. I'm sorry you had to go through that, she said. Will shrugged, but the pain stayed. Ridge made it clear where I stand. Eric approached with a gentle but stern attitude. You're welcome here, son. We could use someone with your eye. Will nodded, feeling his weight lighten somewhat. This was not defeat, it was redirection. Ridge tried to refocus on the designs when he returned to Forrester, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the moment he said those words. Get back to your mom's company. It felt like a fresh start in the heat of the moment. But now, amid the silence, doubts have crept in. Had he pushed too far? Has Katie become even more alienated? Created an enemy in Will, who may one day be more formidable than his father. Steffi sensed his distress. You protected the company, she observed later, as they looked at fabric samples. That's what matters. Ridge managed a slight smile. I hope so, kid. The next few days flew by. Will immersed himself into work at Logan Designs, letting his ideas flow without continual examination. He worked with Eric on a daring new approach, creating pieces that combined classic elegance with a modern edge, challenging Forrester's dominance. Katie watched her kid with pride, seeing echoes of Bill's ambition balanced by her own resilience. The news of the firing rippled throughout the sector. Competitors smiled, while insiders speculated. Brooke attempted to mediate by calling Katie, but their talk ended in awkward silence. The sisters, once so close, now stood on opposite sides of a widening abyss. Ridge put himself into damage control. He visited with the team, reaffirming loyalty and encouraging creativity. However, every success felt overshadowed by the loss. Will's absence left a gap, small but visible. Even if Ridge hadn't accepted it, his fresh perspective had been useful. One evening, Ridge sat alone in his office, the city lights glittering below. He thought about Eric and Katie and the complex web of family and business that defined their life. He had acted decisively, as he usually did. But victory was bittersweet. Across town, Will stood with his mother and Eric, scrutinizing sketches under soft studio lighting. Laughter became easier here. Ambition flared brighter. The conflict between Logan and Forrester had erupted, and Will Spencer had recently been enlisted into the front lines, on the opposing side. Months passed in a flurry of collections, press events, and hushed rivalry. Logan Designs gained traction, thanks to Eric's name and Katie's vision. Will proved himself indispensable, with acute intuition and a rigorous work ethic. He and Elektra managed their complex emotions, with RJ watching from a distance, the tension between the young men palpable even across corporate lines. Ridge stared from his tower, planning his next move. He fired Will to defend his empire, but in doing so, he instead increased the opposition. The phrase, "get back to your mom's company," rang in his head from time to time, reminding him of the line he'd drawn and the bridge he'd burned. In the world of fashion, empires rise and fall at moments like this. And in the world of the Forresters and Logans, family ties were both the strongest links and the most lethal weapons. The story continued as it always did, with passion, betrayal, forgiveness, and the never-ending pursuit of beauty in the midst of catastrophe. Ridge had made his decision. Will had been obliged to make his. And somewhere in the middle, the fate of two legacies hung in the balance, waiting for the next dramatic twist. Ridge's voice pierced through the room like a razor, piercing and cruel, drowning out every last murmur in the design studio. Will froze where he stood, sketches still in his hand, his thoughts racing to keep up with the weight of the words shouted at him. For a moment, it felt surreal, like a line from a poorly written movie that didn't quite land. Ridge's expression, however, indicated that this was not a performance. This was final. The tension had been building for weeks, but Will had refused to notice it. Ridge's conduct shifted subtly, his responses were clipped, and sessions seemed to conclude just as Will started speaking. He'd convinced himself it was stress, that Forrester Creations was under strain, and Ridge was doing too much. Will realized the truth as he stood there in front of everyone. Ridge had made his decision long before the confrontation. Ridge stepped forward, his eyes burning with rage and despair. He didn't shout, yet his calm was somehow worse, heavier and more absolute. He told Will that he was done, that the errors were stacking up, and that the trust had vanished. Each statement hit like a blow, eroding Will's sense of belonging little by bit. It wasn't simply about business. It was personal, and Ridge made no attempt to disguise it. Will attempted to talk, explain, and remind Ridge of the long hours and commitment he'd demonstrated, but Ridge raised a hand, cutting him off without hesitation. There would be no explanations and no second chances. Ridge made it clear, Will was fired, effective immediately. As reality struck in, the space felt smaller, and the walls closed in. The other employees avoided Will's stare, some out of discomfort, others for fear of being next. Several expressions expressed pity, but no one dared to act. Ridge had spoken, and for Forrester Creations, his word was law. Then came the ultimate blow, one that took away any lingering dignity Will believed he could save. Ridge instructed him to return to his mother's company, his words full of contempt. It was more than a suggestion. It was an insult, a rejection of all Will had strived to prove since emerging out of his mother's shadow. Ridge knew just where to strike, and he did not miss. Will's hands trembled as he slowly lowered the sketches on the desk. Those designs had represented promise, ambition, and a future that he believed he could shape on his own terms. Now they were simply paper, useless in the face of Ridge's decision. He felt a burning, combustible wrath rise in his chest, but beneath it was something worse: humiliation. He straightened his back, refusing to let Ridge see him collapse. If this was it, he'd depart on his feet. Will held Ridge's gaze, his voice firm despite the turmoil within him. He claimed he never demanded special treatment or favors. He wanted to earn his place, to be known for his work rather than his last name. Something sparked in Ridge's eyes for a fleeting second before disappearing. Ridge did not soften. He stated that wanting something and being good enough for it were two very different things. He accused Will of arrogance, claiming that he earned a seat at the table without fully comprehending the responsibilities that came with it. Ridge claimed that his decision was motivated by the need to preserve the company and maintain standards. However, the sharpness in his voice indicated deeper wounds, unsolved problems that extended far beyond spreadsheets and runway performances. As Will collected his belongings, memories flooded his head. His first day at Forrester Creations, he felt proud to go through those doors. It was thrilling to see his ideas taken seriously, even when they were contested. He reflected on the times he'd spent with colleagues who had become friends, as well as the mentors who had pushed him to do better. Everything felt as if it was being erased with a simple command: depart. The trek to the door seemed forever. Each step reverberated loudly in his ears, heightening the sensation of finality. Ridge could feel eyes on his back and hear whispers begin to emerge as soon as he turned away. These is how stories like these propagated, how reputations were molded and rebuilt without the individual ever having the opportunity to defend themselves. Will hesitated in the doorway. Not because he hoped Ridge would call him back, but because he wanted to catch his breath. The rage persisted, but it had become colder and more focused. This was not just about getting fired. It was about being discarded, as if he were merely an issue to be solved. He left the building with his head held high, but his chest felt tight. Outside, the usual Los Angeles sun seemed curiously uncaring, beaming as brilliantly as it had that morning when he still had a job. Despite the fact that his life had been severely upended, the world continued to go on. As he walked away, Will's thoughts naturally drifted to his mother. Ridge's comments lingered in his thoughts, and the message was clear. Will would always be defined by where he came from, not by who he was attempting to become. The prospect of returning to his mother's company felt like both a defeat and a haven. He loved and admired her, but he had worked so hard to establish his own identity. Now, that independence had been taken away. Meanwhile, back inside Forrester Creations, Ridge was alone in the office, staring at the door that Will had just left. The rage that had driven his decision began to evaporate, replaced by a thick, unnerving silence. He convinced himself he had done the right thing, and that leadership often required making difficult decisions. However, uncertainty crept in, unpleasant but insistent. Ridge repeated the argument in his head, scrutinizing every word and expression. He questioned whether he'd gone too far, if his personal frustrations had skewed his judgment. But pride would not enable him to express his doubts. Not now. Not ever. To do so would be to admit weakness, which Ridge had spent his entire avoiding. The fallout was immediate. The news of Will's firing traveled swiftly, causing discussion and disagreement among the employees. Some assumed Ridge had finally lost his temper and that this was an impulsive move motivated by ego above rationality. Others claimed that Will had overreached, pushing too hard and too quickly. The reality, as always, was somewhere in the middle. Will described the days that followed as a jumble of emotions. Anger gave way to despair, then to calm determination. He wouldn't allow Ridge's remarks define him. Being fired does not diminish his brilliance, desire, or worth. If anything, it strengthened his resolve. Conversations with his mother were challenging, but honest. She didn't gloat or say, "I told you so." Instead, she listened, offered support, and reminded him that setbacks were a part of any worthwhile path. She made it plain that her company's doors were open to him, but the decision was his. He could return on his own terms, not as a failure looking for shelter, but as a professional preparing for his next move. As Will considered his possibilities, he began to view things differently. Forrester Creations had been a dream, but it was not the only way ahead. There were other opportunities for him to prove himself. Ridge may have closed one door, but he had not concluded Will's story. Ridge, on the other hand, found it more difficult than anticipated to go on. Every time he passed past the design area where Will used to work, he felt a small twinge of regret. He dismissed it as sentimentality, reminding himself that the company was first. However, late at night, alone with his thoughts, he wondered whether he had mistaken control for leadership. Ridge and Will's fight escalated into more than simply a shooting. It represented a larger conflict between generations, between tradition and progress, authority and ambition. Neither man was totally correct, nor entirely wrong. They were two strong personalities colliding in an environment that left little room for compromise. The initial shock faded with time, giving way to new habits and difficulties. Will began rebuilding gradually, learning from the experience, without becoming hardened. Ridge continued to manage Forrester Creations with confidence, even while unanswered issues persisted beneath the surface. What remained was the knowledge that words made in anger have long-term ramifications. Ridge's instruction for Will to return to his mother's company was more than just a dismissal, it was a line in the sand. Whether that barrier would be crossed again or remain a permanent divide was an ongoing drama formed by pride, forgiveness, and the unpredictable turns of fate.